In this lesson, we will find the x and y intercepts. So first we're going to find them looking at our graph, which, let's face it, is pretty easy. An x-intercept is where it would touch the x-axis, and a y-intercept is where it would touch the y-axis. This, of course, is y, this is x. When we write them, generally you would write them as an ordered pair. So the x-intercept here would be 3, 0. The y-intercept here would be 0, 3. Fairly straightforward when it's already graphed for us. One of those for you to try before we do from an equation. The first, the x-intercepts, as you can see there are 2 of them this time, which means -2, 0 and +2, 0. And the y-intercept would be at -4, which means 0, -4. Now, before we move on to the next type of finding intercepts, I want you to notice that in the x-intercepts, the y value is 0, and in a y-intercept, the x value is 0. So we're going to use exactly that information to help us to find the intercepts when it's not graphed for us. So if I wanted to find intercepts, I could plug in a 0 for x, which would of course help me find the y-intercept. Y equals 0 squared, which is 0, plus 5, which of course is 5. So when I plugged in 0, I got 5 out, which means the y-intercept is 5. I'm going to do the same thing here to find the x-intercept. I'm going to replace y with 0 this time. And then I'm going to subtract 5, so I have -5 equals x squared. And when I take the square root, I know that I get I radical 5. Well, what does that mean? That means it's an imaginary number, which means it's not actually going to cross the x-intercept at all. So there are no y or x-intercepts, and there's a y-intercept at 0, 5. Same thing here. I'm going to first, and it doesn't matter which one you do first. This time I'll put the 0 in for y first. That gives me 0 minus 2, which is -2. The absolute value of -2 gives me +2, so x is 5, which means 5, 0. 5 for x, 0 for y. And then the second time I'll plug in 0 for the other, whichever one I did in the first time. Oops. So that gives me -3 equals the absolute value of y minus 2, and we know that the absolute value is always positive, so there's no way for me, because I subtracted that 3 to move it to the other side, there's no way to get a value for y that would give me -3, so there would be no y-intercepts on this question. This next example is a little bit more complicated, as you can see from the equation, but we're going to go about it the same way. I'm either replacing x or y with 0. I'll choose y this time, which means I'm finding the x-intercept. X squared over 9 will stay x squared over 9. 0 plus 3 is 3, squared is 9, so that's plus 9/4 equals 1. I'm going to subtract 9/4 from each side, so on this side I'm really going to think about 1 as 4/4 because 4/4 is 1 whole. So subtracting 9/4 gives me -5/4. To get x squared by itself, I would multiply by 9 on each side, which gives me x squared equals -45/4. And I can see very clearly from this point that I'm taking the square root of a negative, which means I'm not going to continue any further because that's going to be an imaginary number, so there will be no x-intercepts. For the y-intercept, I'll replace x with 0, and then I'll solve the rest of the equation, trying my best to isolate y. So 0 squared over 9 is of course 0, so I get y plus 3 quantity squared over 4 equals 1. So let's get rid of that 4 by multiplying by 4. That leaves me with y plus 3 squared equals 4. Taking the square root of each side, I get y plus 3 equals plus or minus 2. So then I'm going to say y plus 3 equals 2, and y plus 3 equals negative 2, and solve each. Subtracting 3, I get negative 1, and subtracting 3, I get negative 5, which means 0, negative 1, and 0, negative 5. I, of course, could graph that using Desmos and just double check that, but that it's the two y-intercepts, and there would be no x-intercepts. Here's a simpler one for you to try on your own. So press pause, do this question, then press play to check your work. If I start by plugging 0 in for y, I get x squared minus 1 equals 0. I would add the 1 to each side, which would leave me with 1 equals the x squared. I would take the square root of each side to get x equals plus or minus 1. So my x-intercepts would be 1, 0, and also negative 1, 0. So there are two x-intercepts. For the y-intercept, I of course would replace x with 0. 0 squared is 0, minus 1 is negative 1. So at the point 0, comma, negative 1 is where this parabola would cross the y-axis.